Chapter 25, Section 3 of J.B. Bury's The Student's Roman Empire, Part 2. Recording by Lenny. The Student's Roman Empire, Part 2, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 25, Literature from the Death of Tiberius to Trajan, Section 3. Literature under Trajan. After the death of Domitian, there was, according to contemporary writers, a revival of literature. This revival has probably been exaggerated, but it is certain that history, at least, and oratory regained their freedom. Nerva would doubtless have been a patron of men of letters, but his reign was too short to affect literature. Trajan was not a man of culture, and did little directly to further learning, but he was certainly not against it. He showed special favor to the Greek rhetorician Dion Chrysostom, and he wrote himself Memories of the Dacian War. His answers to Pliny's letters are brief and to the point. The private recitations of literary compositions, which had been a marked feature in the reign of Domitian, are now less conspicuous. This may be partly due to the greater liberty which orators enjoyed under Trajan. Decimus Junius Juvenalis was born at Aquinum, probably about 55 A.D. He busied himself in his youth with rhetorical studies, and served in the army. In the year 81 A.D. he served under Agricola in Britain, as the tribune or prefect of a Dalmatian cohort. He lived far into the reign of Hadrian, by whom he seems to have been banished to Egypt in the year 135 A.D., at the age of 80. But the question of the banishment is very difficult. There is some evidence for supposing that the populace declaimed certain offensive verses of Juvenal in the theatre in the emperor's presence, and that Hadrian, unable to punish the people, punished the innocent poet. Juvenal's 16 satires were published in 5 books at different times, like the Sylvae of Statius. The exact date at which they appeared are not certain. He states that indignation at crime and folly drove him to write satire. Si natura negat, facit indignatio versum. And he paints in vivid and dark colors, often with revolting realism, the social vices of his age. The persons whom he introduces have either fictitious names or belong to the past, especially to the reigns of Nero and Domitian. His verses are forcible and pointed, and the standard of morality which he sets up has been so much admired in modern times that some churchmen have thought that he must have owed something to the inspiration of Christianity. But his morality was really the stock virtue of the rhetorical schools, well and eloquently expressed. We cannot take too seriously the declamatory invectives and biting epigrams which he launches against his contemporaries. He was not concerned to give a true picture of his times. He wrote his satires at once to make an effect and gratify his spleen. Their value for us lies in the accessory parts of the pictures. They enable us to realize more vividly than we could otherwise do life and manners at Rome under Domitian, Trajan, and Hadrian. The first satire gives a general description of the follies and vices of the day, and forms a general introduction to the satires. The poet defines his subject as the whole of human life, men's passions, pleasures, and business. Quidquid agunt homines votum timor ira voluptas gaudia discursus nostri farrago libelli est. It may be dangerous to attack the living, but he may at all events show up the sins of the dead, whose ashes are interred on the Flaminian and Latin ways. Experiar quid concedatur in illos, quorum Flaminia tegitur cinis atque Latina. The second deals with gross vices practised by hypocritical philosophers and hidden under a cloak of austerity. The third with the dangers and vexations of life in Rome. The fourth contains the travesty of Domitian's concilium, of which a brief account has been given in a previous chapter. The fifth describes the wretched life of a parasite, and the rebuffs and scorn which he endures for the sake of a poor dinner. The sixth, which is the most powerful of all, paints in heightened colors the fashions, follies, and vices of contemporary women. The 7th portrays the struggles and poverty of men of letters. The 8th holds up to ridicule pride in long pedigrees. It were better to be the son of Thersites and able to wield the arms of Achilles than to have Achilles for sire and be a Thersites oneself. Malo pater tibi sit Thersites, dumodo tu sis aiacidae similis vulcaniaque arma capeças, quam te Thersitai similem producat Achilles. The 9th treats of vices common in the time of Juvenal. The theme of the 10th is the vanity of human wishes. It is shown that what seems to be best is often worst, and that men know not what is really best for them. They are often ruined if the gods take them at their word. Evertere domos totas optantibus ipsis dii faciles, nocitura toga, nocitura petuntur militia. The 11th, in the form of an invitation to a friend to a simple dinner, holds up to ridicule the prevalent luxury at table. The 12th celebrates the safe return of a friend from a voyage, and describes the perils of the ocean. It also satirizes fortune hunters, captatores, who pay court to the rich and childless. The 13th, a consolation to a certain Calvinus, who had been cheated of 10 sestertia, 80 pounds, is full of Stoic doctrines epigrammatically expressed. Calvinus is admonished that such crimes are the order of the day. Perjury is general, and it would be absurd to raise an outcry for such a trifle. Besides, only small minds desire revenge. It is a feminine weakness. Quipe minuti semper et infirmi est animi exiguique voluptas ultio. Continuo si collige quod vindicta nemo magis gaudet quam femina. Calvinus is bidden to leave his false friend to his own devices, for he is not likely to stop at the first crime, and will probably sooner or later come to a bad end. The 14th enlarges on the theme that children learn vice, and especially avarice, from the example of their parents. The 15th describes a quarrel between Ombi, cum ombu, and Tentera, Dendera, in Upper Egypt, at a religious feast held by the Ombites and interrupted by the Tenterites. The latter were put to flight, and one of them was caught and devoured by the Ombites. The 16th sketches the advantages of a soldier's life. The 7th satire is interesting and important for literary history, and deserves special notice in this place. The bulk of it seems to have been written under Trajan, but the introduction to have been added in the reign of Hadrian, under whose auspices poetry and other studies are described as reviving. Et spes et ratio studiorum in Caesare tantum. Hitherto, men of letters have been forced, in order to support life, to engage in the meanest pursuits. The poets have had no Mecenas to patronize them. The most a rich man, who pretends to have a taste for poetry, will do is to lend a dusty and inconvenient room for the poet to give a recitation, and send his freedmen to applaud. The best poets, like Statius, had to write verses to order for the stage, in order to get a living. The historians are worse off than the poets. Their task is more laborious, and they get less. Who will give an historian as much as one would give to the actuarius who reads aloud the daily chronicle? Quis dabit historico quantum daret acta legenti? The rhetoricians were miserably paid too. The profession of a music master was far more lucrative. Rich Quintilian was quite an exception. The fact that so little encouragement was given to poetry by Trajan may have been partly the cause why there was no distinguished poets in his reign, with the exception of Juvenal himself. There were a few of less note, and known to us only by name. Caninius, who set himself to the task of an epic on the Dacian war of Trajan, and Pasenus Paulus, who wrote elegies figuratively in the house of Propertius, may be mentioned. The most striking literary figure of Trajan's principate, and one of the greatest historians of the world, was Cornelius Tacitus. In a history of the early empire, he and his works claim special attention, because his writings, so far as they have been preserved to us, are our chief authority. We have to thank him for most of the details which we know about the reigns of Tiberius, Claudius, and Nero, and about the civil wars which followed Nero's death. If his works had been entirely preserved, he would have been our main guide from the death of Augustus to the death of Domitian. It is because large portions of his writings have been lost that we are so ill informed about the history of Caligula and that of the Flavian emperors. Of the life of Tacitus we know little. He was born about 54 A.D., and in his early years studied jurisprudence and rhetoric. He went through the ordinary senatorial career, beginning as a military tribune under Vespasian, becoming quaestor under Titus, aedile or tribune, and then praetor in 88 A.D. under Domitian. While praetor, he was also one of the quindecimviri to whom the care of the Sibylline books was entrusted. We have already seen that he married a daughter of Agricola. After the return of Agricola to Rome, Tacitus, probably in the year 90, obtained a post in the provinces, either as legatus of a legion in Lower Germany or as governor of Belgica, and was absent from Rome for 4 years, during which his father-in-law died. Under Nerva, in 98 A.D., he was promoted to the consulship. Of the rest of his life we only know that he was occupied with his great historical works. It seems possible that his death took place in the first years of Hadrian. The works of Tacitus which have come down to us, wholly or partially, are 5 in number. 1. His earliest work, a consequence of his rhetorical studies, was the Dialogus de Oratoribus, which perhaps appeared soon after 80 A.D. The dialogue is supposed to have taken place in the 6th year of Vespasian, 75 A.D., and the speakers are the most celebrated rhetoricians and men of letters of that time, including Curiatus Maternus, Vipstanus Messala, Aper, and Julius Secundus. The object of the work is to trace and explain the decline of oratory under the Empire. The causes which he assigns are both political and social, and in the earliest work the republican sympathies and anti-imperial bias of the author can be seen plainly. It also exhibits the same psychological acuteness and the same skill in saying sharp things which are distinguishing marks of his historical works. In point of style, he is under the influence of Cicero. 2. The next composition of Tacitus, the life and character of Julius Agricola, his father-in-law, has been already noticed in connection with Agricola's work in Britain. It was written at the beginning of Trajan's reign. The influence of Sallust is conspicuous, and the very form of the work, as a historical monograph, resembles the Catiline and Jugurtha. The same influence is also evident in 3. The Germania, which appeared in the same year and of which some account has already been given. It was a result of the researches which the author had been making for some years back with a view to a large historical work, but which he now published in a separate form a propos of the work of Trajan on the Rhine. In describing the manners and institutions of German communities, Tacitus cannot resist pointing comparisons between the simplicity of the barbarians and the corruption of Roman civilization. He remarks, for example, that good manners are of more avail there than good laws elsewhere, and that there no man laughs at vices. But it is absurd to suppose, as some have done, that the book was written merely as a hit at Rome. 4. The Historiae, consisting of about 12 or 14 books, was written under Trajan, and embraced the period from the elevation of Galba to the death of Domitian. Unluckily, only the first 4 books and part of the 5th have come down. These are taken up with the events of 69 and 70 A.D. Owing to the loss of the later books, our knowledge of the reign of the Flavian emperors is very fragmentary, and this loss is especially to be regretted, as the author was a contemporary of the events about which he wrote. The Annals, entitled From the Death of the Divine Augustus, was likewise written under Trajan, and was published between 115 and 117 A.D. It embraced the period between Augustus and Galba, 14 to 68 A.D., and, as the material is arranged chronologically, all the various events of each year being, with few exceptions, grouped together, the work is designated by the author himself as Annales. The first 6 books, which contain the reign of Tiberius, are extant, with the exception of the greater part of Book 5. The next books, 7 to 10, and a portion of 11, which comprise the reign of Gaius and the first year of Claudius, are lost. Books 12 to 15 and a part of 16, bringing us down to the year 66 A.D., are preserved, but the end is lost, and it is not certain of how many books the work originally consisted. Tacitus had made further plans for historical work, but they were not carried out. He intended, if he had lived, to lead up to his annals by a work on the principate of Augustus, and also, at the other extremity, to continue his histories by a work on the principates of Nerva and Trajan. If these designs had been executed, he would have covered the whole imperial period down to the death of Trajan. The political sympathies of Tacitus penetrate his whole work, and while they give it much of its literary flavour, they also diminish its historical value. He was an aristocrat in his views, sympathized with the Senate of the Republic, and disliked the imperial constitution. Although his common sense obliged him to confess that the empire was a necessity, it was a necessity against which his heart revolted, and which the events which he saw with his own eyes in the last years of Domitian rendered still more odious to him. It was a calamity, he thought, due to the anger of the gods against the Roman state. His historical works are written to arraign the empire, and he sees everything in the worst light, even if he does not intend to misrepresent. We have already seen how he sets up Germanicus as a foil to Tiberius, and Corbulo as a foil to Nero. The aggressions of the emperors on the functions of the Senate are crimes in his eyes, and he regards the Roman world as in a state of servitude. Yet, on the other hand, he despised the vain talk about liberty by which such men as Helvidius Priscus courted martyrdom, and he laid down the principle that, seeing monarchy to be a necessity, we should pray for good emperors and put up with whatever kind we get. Connected with his prejudice in favour of the Senate is his prejudice in favour of Rome and Italy. He tolerates the provinces, but takes no interest in them, and has not the slightest conception that their needs justify the empire. In estimating the work of an emperor, the character of his provincial administration would have small weight with Tacitus, who thinks far more of a disturbance in Rome than of distant events affecting a whole country. With these narrow and old-fashioned views, he was unable to see the true significance of the empire, on which he pondered so much, and on which he has made many acute observations. His lack of interest in provincial matters affects his history in another way which is much more irritating. It makes him indifferent to geographical details, and thus it is often hopeless to follow on the map his vague descriptions of warfare in Britain, Germany, Armenia, or Thrace. Like Livy, he cared little for historical research, and was far more concerned with the form than with the matter of his work. The military parts of his history are generally judged to be untrustworthy. Yet, in spite of these faults, Tacitus is always regarded as one of the greatest historians. This is mainly due to his excellence as an artist in style. He wrote for effect, and he was ready to sacrifice facts to art. His picture of Tiberius is a great literary achievement, but at the expense of historical truth. His work abounds in telling epigrams and in acute and cynical observations which show great psychological insight. Many of his phrases have become familiar quotations, such as omne ignotum promirifico, maior ex longinquo reverentia. His style is concise, but always dignified and cold, never passionate or declamatory. His points of contact with his contemporaries should be observed. In bitterness, in his view of the degeneracy of society, in writing for effect, he resembles Juvenal, while in his taste for pointed epigram he shows that he belongs to the same age as the court poet Martial. Pliny the Younger belonged originally to the family of the Cecilii, which was settled at Como, in Transpadane, Italy. His father was Lucius Cecilius Silo, and his own name before adoption was probably Plinius Cecilius Secundus. He was 18 years old at the time of the eruption of Vesuvius, 79 A.D., so that he must have been born about 61 A.D. During his boyhood there was no school at Comum, but he was taught well and wrote a Greek tragedy at the age of 14. On his father's death he was placed under the guardianship of Virginius Rufus, and was presently sent to Rome to finish his education, where he attended the lectures of Quintilian in rhetoric. But it was the young man's uncle on the mother's side, Gaius Plinius Secundus, whom we have already met, who exercised most influence on his studies and his future career. He and his mother were staying with his uncle at Misenum when the fatal eruption of Vesuvius took place, which caused his uncle's death. The young Cecilius was adopted by his uncle's will into the Plinian family, and henceforward his name was Gaius Plinius Cecilius Secundus. A year later Pliny pleaded his first cause before the court of the Centumviri in the Basilica Julia. Soon after this he was appointed one of the Decemviris Litibus Iudicandis, who, by a regulation of Augustus, presided over the centumviral court, under the general control of a praetor. He next became a military tribune of the Legion III Gallica, which was stationed in Syria, 82 to 83 A.D. On returning to Rome he was appointed a Sewir of the Roman Knights, and held this office until he became quaestor, probably in 83 A.D. His next step was the tribunate of the plebs, 10th of December 91 A.D., and he was promoted to be praetor in 93 A.D., the emperor having dispensed him from the interval fixed by the lex annalis. In this rapid advancement in the senatorial career Pliny was supported by his former guardian, Virginius Rufus. About this time he successfully aided in the prosecution of a proconsul of Baetica, but this action seems to have injured him in the favour of Domitian. The death of the tyrant was a relief to him. He had been already appointed prefect of the Aerarium Militare. Nerva promoted him to be prefect of the Aerarium Saturni likewise. These duties so much engrossed his time that he renounced pleading in the courts, and it was with much difficulty that he was persuaded, in 100 A.D., to plead the cause of the provincials of Africa against the extortionate proconsul Marius Priscus. The accusers were successful. Marius was condemned. In the same year Pliny was advanced by Trajan to the consulship, which he held in September and October. It devolved upon him to thank the emperor on the first day of this office, and he did so in a panegyric which has been preserved, and which, though not interesting from a literary point of view, is of great historical value, as it gives an account of the acts of Trajan in the first years of his reign. In the following year Pliny was again induced to act as the advocate of provincials against an oppressive governor. He undertook the cause of Baetica against Classicus. Some time after this he received the honour of an augurship. He had given up his treasury appointment and returned to his occupation as a pleader. He was also appointed curator aue Tiberis et riparum et cloacarum urbis. Two important cases occurred in 104 and 106 A.D. in connection with Bithynia, and were successfully conducted by Pliny. This led to his appointment, in 111 A.D. probably, as a special legatus in that province, as we have already seen. The date of his death is unknown, but was probably before 115 A.D. He was married 3 times, but had no children. Trajan granted him, however, the ius trium liberorum. The career of Pliny is interesting, as it illustrates how citizens belonging to an Italian or provincial municipium rose to the highest offices in the state. His letters are interesting as illustrating the life, opinions, and feelings of an enlightened and generous Roman gentleman. But he was neither a great writer nor a great statesman. He could discharge meritoriously the ordinary duties of a senator. He was an ardent reader, a careful and pleasant writer, but had no ideas. He was rich and liberal. We find him giving pecuniary help to Quintilian and Martial. He remedied the want of a school at Comum by paying 1/3 of the salary of a teacher. He also gave his native town a public library at the cost of 1,000,000 sesterces (£8,000), and granted 500,000 more for the maintenance of poor children. His letters prove that he was a warm friend, a loving husband, a kind master to his slaves, and that he always honestly wished to do the right thing. The letters of Pliny consist of 1. 9 books of letters dating from 97 to 109 A.D., and 2. the correspondence with Trajan, chiefly from the Bithynian period, of which specimens were given in the preceding chapter. They concern all sorts of subjects, and show the character of the author and his relations with his friends in the most favorable light. He is very vain, but then he is very candid. The letters were written with a view to publication, and therefore they have not the freshness and directness of the letters of Cicero, who was Pliny's model, as he tells us himself. He owns that his great desire is to be remembered by posterity. There is consequently a great deal of self-consciousness in the epistles. Tacitus and Pliny were intimate friends. In one of his letters Pliny tells a story, how at the Circensian games Tacitus sat next an unknown person, who entered into learned conversation with him, and after some time asked, "Are you an Italian or a provincial?" "You know me," said Tacitus, "from your reading." "Are you Tacitus or Pliny?" asked the stranger. Besides the panegyric of Pliny, which is a specimen of the style of rhetoric then in fashion, we have a fragment of a dialogue on the theme, "Was Virgil an orator or a poet?" Vergilius orator an poeta, by P. Annius Florus. An African by birth, he had competed under Domitian at the Capitoline Agon, and, unfairly according to himself, had not been crowned. Leaving Rome, he travelled about and finally settled as a man of letters at Tarraco, where he lived under Trajan. At a later time he returned to Rome and interchanged light verses with the Emperor Hadrian. For he was also a verse writer, and some small fragments of verse under the name of Florus have come down. The work of Hyginus on the jurisprudence of field measurement, of which fragment have come down to us, the treatise of Siculus Flaccus de conditionibus agrorum, the works on orthography of Caper and Villius Longus, which belong to this period, can only be mentioned. End of chapter 25, section 3.